Robert Smalls, born into slavery and who was working as the pilot for the Planter, a civilian boat contracted by the Confederate Army as a transport, fired up the boiler of the ship he was on, the Planter, along with the other crew members. And while the captain, first mate, and chief engineer had gone into Charleston for the night, they took the boat out of Charleston Harbor, picked up family members, and proceeded to sail past Fort Sumter. Robert Smalls knew the signals, knew the safe channel, and he was able to pass by Fort Sumter. Once he got beyond the guns of Fort Sumter, he sped the boat up towards the Union blockade off of Charleston, raised the white flag, and to the surprise of the crew members, turned the boat over to the Union Army. This act made headlines and earned Smalls a small reward in a meeting with the Lincoln administration. He went on to become one of the first African American pilots of a military vessel. Robert Smalls was to hold a variety of elected offices, including seats in the South Carolina legislature and the U.S. Congress. 150 years ago, on April 14, 1865, Robert Smalls was here to witness the re-raising of the American flag. I am honored tonight to introduce Michael Moore, the great-great-grandson of Robert Smalls. Michael received a BA from Syracuse University and an MBA from Duke University. He has had a dynamic business career with leadership experience in Fortune 500 and entrepreneurial companies. I'm glad he could be with us today, and I've asked Michael to reflect today on what the Civil War and its conclusion meant to enslaved persons and where we are 150 years later. Michael.
Good evening. Thank you for the introduction. Since this is a historical event, we're among historians, I'll just say that was May 13th, 1862. But it's always a real honor for me to be here in Charleston. I have such history here. My great-great-grandfather, Robert Smalls, my great-grandfather, Samuel J. Banfield, and others, were here. And in particular, I went upstairs when we were coming over in the boat, and I just sort of took a moment as we were coming out and reflected on the fact that, had Robert Smalls faltered, had he erred in his trip out toward the mouth, had he been nervous, had he, made a mistake, I would not be here. And so it's I feel the gravity of the history in this city in general, the beauty of this city, but even above and beyond that, I have a real family connection, which it's always just wonderful to be here. And it's doubly wonderful to be working on a project with the mayor in terms of the International African American Museum, so that's a wonderful thing. When I think about 150 years ago, again, knowing that my great-great-grandfather was here, 150 years ago, again, it just fills me with a deep sense of pride and just of history. But when I think broadly about how the newly freed, former enslaved people, what was on their mind, I can only imagine that it was just an amalgam of all sorts of very intense feelings. Of course, there was great jubilation and joy that the institution of slavery, the yoke of that institution had finally been removed from the neck of that community of people. But at the same time, if we're real about it, the history, the day-to-day history of African Americans in this country could only render sort of the idea of freedom in the most abstract of terms. I'm sure there was all sorts of doubt and fear about what that meant. Robert Smalls, 150 years ago was in a decidedly more privileged position because of his heroism, because he had already, as we mentioned, on the morning of May 13, 1862, he was free. He would come back and was working for the Union, fighting for the freedom of others, but also because he got a reward for the planter. Parenthetically, he didn't get what the law prescribed. I guess Congress couldn't see fit to give that much money to a black man at the time. But nevertheless, that gave him and his family just an enormous advantage, an enormous leg up on the first round of freedom. This moment 150 years ago, when I think about it, it's really the first chapter in what it's probably an inelegant description, but can be called sort of a complicated relationship that African America has had with this country. Certainly it's the only country that we know. We've been here since 1619 and certainly have made the kinds of sacrifices and investment in this country that give us a standing to call it ours, along with others here. But of course also, the experience of discrimination and racism is something that engenders feelings of frustration, let's just say, as well. And so when I think about this day 150 years ago, this was probably the first step along a long path toward freedom that we as a country continue to travel down, but it was an enormous step and a very important one. For another thing that was really of paramount importance for formerly enslaved people 150 years ago, obviously the institution of slavery did not respect the bonds of family and love. So one of the things, there are lots of stories, 150 years ago, there were families really out all around the countryside trying to find other family members. And again, thinking about sort of this complicated kind of amalgam of feelings, I can only imagine just the wonderful hope that being free and having the opportunity to try to find loved ones afforded. But then also, I'm sure that was tempered as days turned into weeks, turned into months and years. For those that were not able to find their loved ones, I can only imagine just the crushing agony that really afforded. Lastly, if you look sort of historically at our country, it has been overall, Mandela's biography, I think, was called The Long Walk to Freedom. And we've had our own long walk to freedom. When the country was founded, it was founded by and for the very elite, maybe even the 1% of the 1%. But over time, obviously, the tent of American freedom and liberty has been extended to other groups. That fight continues today, but when I think again, and when I'm surrounded by the history here, I know that this place and what happened here 150 years ago was an enormous part of that extension of freedom. And I feel so proud and honored to be able to be here. Mr. Mayor, you talked about you were going to take the day off in 50 years at the bicentennial. And you've earned that, but I'll just say to Mr. Stone that if he endeavors to invite me, I'll be back here. I'll promise to be here in 50 years for the bicentennial. So, thank you very much.